Support comes from the Rosa Parks Museum on Troy University's Montgomery campus. Located on the spot of Mrs. Parks' historic 1955 arrest and featuring exhibits that chronicle the history of the Montgomery bus boycott. More information at troy.edu/Rosa Parks.
From Troy Public Radio and Troy University, in partnership with the Alabama World Affairs Council, this is Speaking Globally, and I'm Walter Gavan. Welcome back to Speaking Globally, where we look at the history, politics, and culture of different regions and countries around the world and talk with people who can provide context and insight into some of the most important global issues we face. In October, news of North Korean troops deployed in Russia's war in Ukraine sparked fresh fears of escalation in the conflict. The news also brought renewed scrutiny of North Korea itself and the threat an alliance of so-called dissatisfied states like North Korea and Russia poses to the global world order. Today, we're going to dive into North Korea's history and try to piece together what led us to this point. This is the first of our two-part series on North Korea with renowned Korea expert Dr. Daniel Pinkston, a lecturer of international relations at Troy University. Dr. Pinkston previously served as Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director for the International Crisis Group. He joins us today from Seoul, South Korea.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
As tempting as it is to dive directly into current events involving the Korean Peninsula, and especially North Korea, let's first look at the historical background that led us here. Briefly, what are the historical circumstances that produced a divided Korean peninsula and an insulated, dynastic, and bellicose North Korea?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll try to make it succinct because it depends how far we want to go back in history. But I would just mention briefly that in the late 19th century, there was a East Asian world order that was quite different from the Western Westphalian type of world order. It was hierarchical, with China viewed as the apex or the center of civilization. States around China paid tribute to the Chinese emperor in exchange for recognition and status, whereby the local king would rule. It was contested, it was an ideal, but Korea bought into that for the most part. And then, of course, there was a lot of global geopolitical change at the end of the 19th century as that system collapsed. And Japan most aggressively tried to replace China as this, hegemon in East Asia. So Korea fell under Japanese colonial rule. Of course, there was a war over Korea in 1895 that Japan had defeated China. Korea had asked for Chinese assistance and then slowly brought Korea under Japanese colonial rule, particularly after the war in 1905 with Russia, which kind of excluded Russia's influence from the region. And of course, the U.S. was more concerned as a rising power with its colonial acquisition of the Philippines in the South. So Japan was pretty much clear to expand its imperial holdings at that time, including Taiwan. So Korea had fell under Japanese colonial rule for 35 years, officially from 1910 until the end of World War II in 1945. So at that time, the resistance was based on two pillars or camps for liberation. One was Marxist, Leninist, communist-style revolution, and the other was Wilsonian democratic liberation based on one of Wilson's 14 points. So you had these two camps in the Korean resistance movement. There were governments that were set up outside, but with the end of the war in 1945, the USSR and the US were allies at that time fighting against the Axis powers, and there had been agreements on Japan and the Axis powers losing their colonial holdings, whatever they had acquired through aggression would be returned. And of course, the US and FDR's vision was to begin this decolonization process. The US didn't have the kind of colonial holdings that the European powers did, and some of them wished to reconstitute that. But anyways, as I make a long story long, at that time, the two, former allies during the World War II were unable to agree, and they could not agree on a unified government. So they established a temporary dividing line at the 38th parallel that was only supposed to accept Japanese surrender, the surrender of Japanese troops in this Korean colony. But without being able to reach an agreement, two separate states were established in 1948. And then, of course, a 3-year fratricidal war was fought from 1950 to 1953 that ended in an armistice. That armistice is still in effect, a military ceasefire. It's a military agreement. And that's where we sit today. So two intense rivals who claim to be the full authority and legitimate authority of Korean territory and Korean people. And that's where we stand today.
Can we look back now and see missed opportunities after the Korean War? Did the Cold War obscure our ability to think creatively about what might be possible?
Well, Korea, of course, was one of the fault lines of the Cold War. The Eastern Bloc nations in Europe were somewhat different. If we look at Germany, that was divided, and Korea that was divided, the North Korean regime under Kim Il Sung, who's Kim Jong Un's grandfather, he was a guerrilla fighter, nationalistic communist seeking to oust Japanese colonial rule. So nominally, Marxism, Leninism is supposed to be an internationalist ideology based on working class solidarity. It's supposed to apply to everyone around the world. We saw that was certainly not the case. Even the Soviets, and under Stalin, had kind of nationalistic orientation. But certainly the communist movements in East Asia had much greater nationalistic tint. If we look at Vietnam with Ho Chi Minh and certainly the Kims in North Korea. So that was different from the East Germans, who had to shed any kind of nationalistic orientation because that was wedded to the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, right? So they really embraced this internationalist worker solidarity, Marxism, Leninism. So when that ideology collapsed in 1989, 1990, there was no kind of nationalistic foundations to support their continuation. So North Korea has been very, very resilient. Some people viewed with the end of the Cold War in 1989, 1990, that period, there was a period of rapprochement and diplomatic activities to freeze and then end North Korea's nuclear program, which had started as early as the 1950s when they were establishing the institutions and the recruiting the human resources, which is the most important element of any weapons of mass destruction program. You need the engineers and scientists to sustain that, in addition to financial support and political support over time. And North Korea has demonstrated all of that. So when it became clear that North Korea was working on a nuclear weapons program in the mid 80s, early 90s, the U.S. had contemplated destroying the nuclear facilities back in 1993, 1994. But a deal was cut when former President Jimmy Carter visited North Korea and reached a gentleman's agreement with Kim Il Sung in June 1994. But then Kim died a couple weeks later. North Korea began to experience economic deprivation, food insecurity, a great famine, because the subsidies were cut off from the former Soviet Union, energy and food support, trade credits, and all of that. So this program called the Agreed Framework which was designed for North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons ambitions and come into full compliance with its international obligations for nuclear inspections and to ensure that no nuclear materials were diverted to military programs and so forth. But that was taking time. In exchange for that, the West was to provide 2 light water reactors, which are proliferation resistant. Those reactors are difficult to operate for the production of weapons grade plutonium. It can be done, but it's observable, and there would be time to react to that. And also, the U.S. and its partners was to provide heavy fuel oil for energy to compensate for a couple of nuclear reactors that North Korea had shut down or had suspended construction of. So that deal fell apart in the early 2000s. It had been discovered that North Korea was working on a clandestine uranium enrichment program, which is a different path to acquiring fissile material, the bomb fuel for nuclear bombs. That's easier to hide. So this deal fell apart back in 2002. And then North Korea began to accelerate its nuclear weapons program. There have been other attempts at diplomacy. There was the 6-party talks during the second Bush or George W. Bush administration. That fell apart in late 2008. And we're kind of at an impasse or a deadlock right now.
When one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating is that on top of all this, they have this sort of, I would guess, probably unique dynasty that is founded upon the Kim family, fused with almost this, Stalinist approach to government. Is that something that's peculiar to Korean culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. With the first dynastic succession, back when Kim Il sung died in 1994, the Korean Workers' Party had been preparing for about 20 years. In the late 60s and early 70s, they began to look at who would be a suitable successor. There was some internal discussions. Originally, Kim Il sung's younger brother, who died about a year or so ago, he was like 100 years old or so, 100, 101. He was born in 1920. And he had been a focus of being, Kim's successor. But then as he got older, and there was this internal infighting, and Kim Jong-il, his oldest son, was quite ambitious and maneuvered to put himself in position. But there was internal opposition and questions about that. So it was kind of secretive at first. But the official decision was made in 1974 at a Central Committee meeting or Politburo meeting. And it was announced internally, but not externally. So we began to hear, or if we look back in the archives and look at media and literature from that time, they referred to this enigma, this anonymous person or entity called the Party Center. They spoke about the Party Center, and no one really knew who that was precisely. So, of course, with speculation, people thought it was Kim Jong-il. But Kim Jong-il, as a successor, was finally announced formally into the outside world in 1980 at a party congress. So in the communist world, this was kind of a shock. This kind of nepotism was a criticism of the capitalist world. So there was kind of opposition, surprise to this, but of course, Communist Bloc had to accept this, and that succession went through. And then with Kim Jong-un's succession, which happened in the last couple of weeks of December 2011, Kim Jong-il's health was poor, and Kim Jong-un was young at that time. He was born in, we believe, 1983. Some sources say 1984. So he was still in his 20s when this happened, or when his father died and, rose to control the military and party and the state in rapid succession. So people have become used to that now. And in East Asian context, going back to the older, kind of traditional cultural norms, son taking over for his father's, business, whatever that is, whether it's in politics or industry or what have you, that's readily acceptable. It's not considered so strange. So in Singapore, that has happened. Xi Jinping's father was, revolutionary leader in the PRC. Other leaders, Park Geun-hye was president. Her father was president in South Korea. So it's not as odd or unusual in East Asia as it would be viewed in the West, I think.
Let's move now more specifically to the peninsula itself. What was the significance of North Korea's recent moves to blow up roads and railways linking it to South Korea? What was the message it was trying to send?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've gone round and round with people, and they're different, discussing it here with North Korea watchers, and that it's not really militarily significant. I think it's signaling to the outside world that they are dissatisfied and they're essentially burning their bridges. They're not interested in any reconciliation or rapprochement or any kind of diplomatic solution. We're in deadlock for now. Then I think for internal consumption, it's to demonstrate that the world really is menacing. South Korea really is not one of us. It's a separate, hostile state. We have to take these measures to protect ourselves. So to instill fear internally. Does it change any, posture or policy for South Korea and its allies? Not really. Does it provide any kind of defensive barriers? Were they afraid that South Korea is going to roll north and invade, and this is cutting off their invasion routes? I think that's pretty insignificant and not realistic. And I don't think they believe that the South Korea and its allies are going to invade North Korea, or they wouldn't be, executing these types of operations and sending troops to Russia and so forth. I visited North Korea 5 times. A couple of times I traveled to the DMZ from the northern side. And it's been some years now. The last time I did that was in 2013. The posture and the orientation didn't seem one of very militarized area. I kept my eyes open looking for military units. I did see some soldiers working out in the field, some of the agricultural fields out there. And of course, military bases were hidden in the mountainsides or behind mountains or in valleys and things like that. But as far as the type of roadblocks or tank traps you could set up, there was hardly any of that. In the area around the DMZ, when we approached the joint security area in Panmunjom, was very relaxed. It didn't seem like the attitude or the orientation of someone that was expecting an imminent, talks about an imminent invasion from the south. And the attitude on the southern side, of course, is quite different if you visit from the south. It's more somber and serious experience. When they brief you, they don't point at anyone and, don't say anything and, all this kind of thing, providing the sense of danger and not to provoke the North Koreans. So there's this kind of different attitude. I don't think it really matters. It makes any difference on the policy side. Does it change what we have to do in our doctrine, our orientation, our posture, our military deployments, our policy? It's kind of it's meaningless for the most part.
Let's look at things then from the South Korean perspective. How are they responding to these new provocative actions, and what is their long-term strategy?
Well, I think if you look at history, and usually military people are amateur or great professional historians, because we have to study military science and prepare for conflict. So we look at past cases. Now, of course, there's a great concern because the advancements in North Korea's weapons development. So their weapons capability in the area of WMD have advanced rapidly over the past 10 to 15 years. But on the other hand, if you look historically and go back, say, from the 1960s or early 1960s, compared to the last decade, actually, North Korea has been pretty well behaved. So there was a lot of rhetoric in 2017 with Trump and Kim Jong Un going back and forth, and people talking about war and all of that, but no, acts of war or armed attacks have occurred. They've been very limited compared to what was going on in the 1960s. I mean, people were getting shot at and shot up in the DMZ and patrols like every day, almost every day. They shot down aircraft, shot up boats on naval patrols. They've sunk boats, captured fishing vessels, sent special forces into the South back in '68. In fact, it's right near my house here, what was formerly the presidential office prior to current President Yoon moving it a couple of years ago. There's a mountain ridge where they sent special forces dressed in South Korean military uniforms, and there was a shootout nearby the Blue House, the presidential residence. So, I mean, it was really hot and heavy in those days. So, over the past 10 years, there was a mining incident. They set a couple mines in the DMZ, and two South Korean soldiers stepped on the mines. I think they lost their legs. So, there was a little flare up there, a flare up in rhetoric, but the demonstrations of blowing up these roads. A couple years back, they blew up a inter-Korean cooperation center that South Korean Ministry of Unification had built. So, as these kind of symbolic actions, but in terms of people dying, shooting down aircraft, sending special forces into the South to engage in assassination, those types of things. Actually, North Korea has been relatively restrained over the past 15 years or since during the Kim Jong-un regime compared to the past and what they could do. I mean, they have a lot of terrible things they could do. They've been launching these balloons. It's an annoyance, but it's not truly going to put civil aviation in danger at the Incheon airport, the main international airport, which is actually quite close to North Korea, out on the west coast, outside of Seoul, or with maritime shipping. Incheon is also a major port. So I don't think we're going to go to war over some trash balloons and episodes of GPS jamming. People have gotten used to it. South Korea is a busy and competitive place. People have to get on with their lives with work and school and everything else. So people are aware of it. But I think, one danger is that if people get so accustomed to it, they could become the frog in the pot of boiling water, right, as they turn things up. And if there were a real contingency, or let's say we did move to wartime and we become complacent about these balloons, and let's say they were to launch balloons that were full of anthrax, for example, a bioweapon. Anthrax is actually the disease. The spores are Bacillus anthracis, or what they're called officially. But something like that, or to coordinate with other types of gray zone actions or provocations, cyber attacks. Maybe they could try a land grab. There are 5 northwestern islands off the coast. The most northwestern one is called Pengyangdo, and under the armistice, those islands are recognized as under control of the South. But Pengyangdo is actually closer to Pyongyang than it is to Seoul, and South Korean Marines are out there on that island. So those 5 islands up there that are closer to the North Korean coast, that's kind of a concern. Maybe they would try an amphibious landing or some kind of limited attack or limited land grab. And this is the kind of gray zone activity that concerns me because of their nuclear arsenal. So if they engage in these kind of salami tactics and achieve some kind of fait accompli through these gray zone tactics and do this behind the shield of their nuclear arsenal, and then rattle their nuclear weapons and say, you better not retaliate, or, they roll out their nuclear missiles, and then, intelligence platforms see them moving their nuclear arsenal into position. Then it becomes a crisis, or could become a crisis, and very dangerous. So this is the kind of the thing we deal with, the shadow of this kind of threat in South Korea.
My guest today has been Dr. Daniel Pinkston, Lecturer of International Relations at Troy University. Be sure to check out part 2 of this series, where Dr. Pinkston and I will cover the growing threat of alliances between dissatisfied states like North Korea, Russia, and China. Our podcast is recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio on the Troy University campus and is produced and edited by Austin Toy with help from Kyle Gassett. I'm Walter Gavan, and I look forward to talking with you again soon on Speaking Globally.